X's and Bros, right here on the Michigan Sports Network.
Welcome back here to X's and Bros on the Michigan Sports Network. Ben Glaze, Ryan Elke, Anthony Bellino, all joining you. Join us now on the horn covering the Detroit Lions for our friends over at Pride of Detroit. Our good friend, Jeremy Reisman. Find him on Twitter at Detroit Online. And, of course, always be sure to read Pride of Detroit every morning for the latest and greatest in Detroit Lions news. Jeremy, my man, good morning to you. How are you? How's life? How are things, partner?
Doing great, Anthony. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. You know, I fixed the transfer portal early this morning. You know, just a typical Wednesday here on the show, man. So it's great to have you with us. And of course, yesterday, Tracy Walker puts out that social media post, and we all knew that the writing was on the wall at that point. Let's dive right into the biggest news of the day yesterday for the Lions. They decide to part ways with Tracy Walker. In your estimation, what was the leading factor in this?
Unfortunately, it was his contract, really. He's due to hit the books for over $12 million in terms of cap hit. Just kind of the way some of these contracts are loaded, they're very backloaded. So his salary was upwards of $8 million. And so, unfortunately for him, he'd slid down the depth chart, and some of it was bad luck. Some of it was play. I mean, I just think back to 2022, 2 years ago, that the Lions and this new regime see a ton of potential in the guy. They see him as a leader. They sign him to that 3-year deal thinking, this guy is going to be a leader and a foundation of the defense. And then, months later, he tears his Achilles, and that sets him on an entirely different path. And it's a bummer for him because I think he is still very much a talented player. But, he was a guy who was inactive for all 3 playoff games. So, you're not going to pay $12 million a year to that. And, we've seen the Lions maybe approach guys like him with a pay cut potentially. But I think Tracy Walker is a guy who views his football future is still very much out there somewhere. And, you look at the Lions depth chart here and, even regardless of what they do with a guy like C.J. Gardner-Johnson, he's still on the outside looking in terms of the starting role here in Detroit. And so I don't know if they approached Tracy with anything like that, but even if they were, I wouldn't have expected him to stick around just because the opportunity is probably elsewhere for him.
Jeremy, I've said this a lot about the David Montgomery signing and the allowing to walk of Jamal Williams. And for me, it's always been like this team, they show great respect for the players. It starts with the coaching staff and works itself all the way up, right? But they don't get emotionally attached to a guy where in years past it's like, oh, we got to keep him because he's a fan favorite. Like they're not afraid to move on from different guys. And although it's a difficult situation, it is the reality of the business and the reality of business across the board. No matter if you're playing, professional football or, if you work at your local grocery store, if somebody comes in and they're a better option, they're probably going to get that job, going to get that promotion, et cetera, et cetera. It gives me a lot of faith in this front office that they are willing to make these types of decisions. Does it do the same for you? Do you view it like that? Yeah,
a little bit. Like, I don't necessarily view the Tracy Walker move as a move that, no other team would make. Or I think most teams would look at that and just be like, it's too much. And, I do like that the staff, though, kind of walks that line of, like, they do care about these players a lot. And Dan Campbell even said, I think right before the end of the season, where this team is at, we're going to have to make some difficult decisions, and it's going to hurt. And it's going to, these guys that have been, the old guard, as he refers to them, some of them you're going to have to move on from. Very much Tracy Walker's in that vein. And he even acknowledges, like, I'm going to have to work hard at keeping these guys at a little bit of an emotional distance. And we know that's hard for a guy like Dan Campbell, right? We've seen him, agonize over cuts on Hard Knocks. There was that interview, I think, before Monday night game where he was talking about how much some of the guys that they've moved on from, how important they've been to where the Lions are now. And so I like a front office who will have an emotional attachment to these players and understand the struggle that they're going through, but at the same time aren't afraid to, like you said, make some of these decisions that are going to be tough, that are going to be saying goodbye to the hardworking guys of this team, because you have to treat this as a business if you're going to succeed at times. And players know that too. And I think there might be some guys here and there that get frustrated or, look back at management and think they mishandled certain situations. But I think for the most part, you have very understanding players. I think we don't give them enough credit for their understanding of this is a business. I'm sure this didn't blindside Tracy Walker. He probably wasn't happy with how he was treated in his last year in terms of being a backup, in terms of being benched for guys like Fatu Melifonwu, but he certainly understands it. And so I think you saw it in his Instagram message, right? Like, he was very respectful to the Lions. He had that, thanked a lot of people inside and outside the organization. So, yeah, I think the Lions are walking that line of being respectful but not letting it impact their decisions.
You know, Jeremy, when you look at that secondary spot, right, regardless of what happens here with C.J. Gardner-Johnson, because it was Tracy Walker's injury that opened the door for Kirby Joseph to get a lot of playing time. And then it's like, holy mackerel, this Kirby Joseph guy, he is the real deal. And then you have C.J. Gardner-Johnson's injury, and Fatu Melifonwu kind of comes along, and we kind of see what, Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell had saw in him when they decided to select him out of Illinois. And so for me, it's, you look at C.J. Gardner-Johnson, you look at kind of what they have as the youth movement back there in the secondary. Do you think that C.J. is a guy that they're going to try to bring back?
I mean, they might approach him about it, but I'm just having a hard time kind of viewing, him being the kind of guy that wants to come back. Not that he didn't enjoy his time here, not that he doesn't have a good relationship with Aaron Glenn, but we heard his kind of level of frustration when he worked his butt off to get back from that big injury that would end most people's season. He comes all the way back, and then he comes to a rotational role, and he wasn't afraid to say it to the media. Like, he wasn't okay with that. He thought it was a little bit of disrespect that he worked all his way back to just play, 40% of the snaps. And looking forward, that's kind of the role that you'd expect of him going forward. I know he's a very talented player and a hard worker and brings a little bit of edge that I think the defense needs, but I think if Fatu Melifonwu and Kirby Joseph are kind of the foundations of what they want to be at safety right now. So, I given the pride that he has, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, I think he's going to be looking for a bigger opportunity elsewhere, just kind of like Tracy Walker is. So, I would say the Lions would certainly love to have him back, but I don't know how much they're going to be willing to pay for a guy for a rotational role, and I don't think that C.J. Gardner-Johnson is going to look at this opportunity and be like, this is where I can play and maybe – because, he's not going to get a big deal this offseason, right? He kind of bet on himself last year with that one-year deal, and unfortunately the injury knocked him out. So if he wants to kind of parlay 2024 into maybe a bigger contract in 2025, he's going to want to go somewhere where he has the opportunity, and I just don't think that's Detroit.
And it's interesting to me that both Fatu Melifonwu out of Syracuse and Kirby Joseph out of Illinois, both round 3 selections. So just something to keep your eye on. A couple of guys who, you think about the later rounds, and we all kind of, clamor and foam at the mouth over the first rounder. And it's a much different draft coming up with the 29th pick, right? Not picking in the top 10
right.
or in that neighborhood is going to be kind of weird for our fan base. But hopefully it's something we can get used to. So when you look at this secondary group, at what point on the priority list for your offseason, Jeremy, where do you have kind of secondary, whether it's a number one corner, whether it's depth at that position? Do you want to add another safety? Like, what's the priority list for you as far as offseason necessities for this club?
Yeah, for me, outside corner is number one need, and it's not even particularly close. I think it's the one spot where they cannot go into 2024 without an addition. I know people want another edge opposite Aiden, and I know that people want maybe interior defensive line help, but they have bodies there at least that can play. Like Josh Paschal might be your starter next year. He's a guy that's still developing. You have Aleem McNeil. You could bring back a guy like Benito Jones to help stop the run, which they were really good at last year. But at corner, there is no current answers there, and to me, that's a position you got to hit hard immediately. You can't. I don't think this team should go into the draft without adding at least a starting level talent, because you never know if the guy that you want in the draft is going to fall to you. So there needs to be a plan A, B, and C at outside corner, and I wouldn't be surprised to see the Lions add 2 or 3 guys at that position, just because what they did last year unfortunately didn't work out. They tried. They certainly hit it hard, and they got a guy in Brian Branch that can play the nickel pretty well, but outside corner is just it needs a lot of help, and they need to make sure they don't go into the draft absolutely having to have someone, because that's the way you waste draft resources. If you're like, if we didn't finish, getting a starting level guy in free agency, well, then suddenly we're going to have to be over aggressive to make sure we get our guy. And that's just not what Brad Holmes has done in the past. That's not good general managing in general. So I think that's the key. And then, I think you look at that safety room right now, and now you have two starters. You're going to need some backup. You're going to need some depth there. And whether that's getting a guy in the draft or getting some, guys who have maybe veteran experience, it's a pretty young room there, but maybe isn't playing at a starting level position. I think that's kind of a sneaky need as well, because we've seen in the past 3 or 4 years, a starting safety has been knocked out for a pretty significant amount of time. They're a hard-hitting group, right? There's a lot of violent collisions in the secondary, so you want to make sure you have depth there. And the Lions sometimes like to play 3 safeties at the same time. So that's a pretty high on the priority list as well, but maybe a little bit further behind, like guard and maybe an edge guy. But safety is definitely, I would say, probably still top 5 or 6 need for this team.
Jeremy, it's interesting there. So paraphrasing or trying to, because I think I think you made a really good point, if I'm understanding it correctly. You have to address that position in free agency so that you don't hamstring yourself for the upcoming draft, so that you absolutely have to draft a position of need where you can go get what you assume would be the best player available. Am I correct there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's kind of always been my viewpoint of free agency, is you want to cover as many needs as possible in free agency so that you have freedom to kind of do whatever you want in the draft and get the guys you want. I mean, we all know Brad Holmes doesn't pay that much attention to positional need. We know he doesn't necessarily pay that much attention to positional value, right? It's just getting guys that fit what they want. They're, the culture setters there. So if he can go into the draft and sit there at 29 and just be like, I don't care what position it is, we just want one of those guys that's a Dan Campbell guy, that's a gritty guy, we'll take him. And that's what he's done through the first 3 years. It hasn't necessarily been a very needs-based draft. You saw that with running back and linebacker in the first round last year, right? They had DeAndre Swift. They had, Alex Anzalone and had that breakout year from Malcolm Rodriguez. So they didn't need a linebacker. They didn't need a running back, but they found guys that they liked because they had filled most of their other needs in free agency. So that's what I expect them to do again this year.
Is there a guy in free agency in the secondary that might become available that you kind of have your eyes on, or maybe a couple of players that you have circled?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on how aggressive Brad Holmes is going to be, and that's still kind of a question of, now that the team is in a better place, does he crank up the aggressiveness? We saw him go pretty aggressive. I would say maybe like a 7 or 6 out of 10 last year in getting Cameron Sutton. Does he go for now like the top tier guys like Jalen Johnson? I think Jalen Johnson is an outstanding player, and I think he's kind of my white whale this offseason. But I don't know if Brad Holmes is going to go that far. It doesn't seem like it's his MO. But again, we're kind of entering a different phase of general managing for him. So, it could be him. It could be, a lot of people like the idea of bringing Stephon Gilmore to kind of, provide a veteran presence, play with his brother there with Stephen Gilmore. I'm not opposed to that, although, adding a 33 or however old he is, cornerback isn't exactly bringing a ton of youth, and I think that's certainly the point in which a lot of players, particularly at corner where speed and agility is important. That's kind of where the downswing of the career happens. But I think there's a ton of different answers there. I think it's a relatively good cornerback free agency market, and so I certainly expect them to be active there.
Am I crazy now to think that, there might be a guy out there at wide receiver in free agency? He might have a hefty price tag, but it might be worth it. Am I crazy to look at Mike Evans? And I don't do this, Jeremy. I do not do this. I don't look – wide receivers to me are like icing on the cake. If you go out there, we've seen it happen with the Lions in years past. You had, Calvin Johnson and Roy Williams. Like, just because you got a bunch of big receivers does not necessarily mean you're going to win any football games, and there's a hefty price tag to pay for a guy like a Mike Evans. Is this worth even looking at? Is it worth even thinking about?
I think there's a need there. It seems like it would be a little bit against what they generally would do to go after. I'm not sure how old he is, but I think he's in his 30s now, right?
Yeah, I think he's 30.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'm definitely of the viewpoint in which I can't rule anything out with Brad Holmes because he's been a little bit unpredictable every year. But I guess that probably isn't the route I would go. I mean, college wide receivers have gotten to be so good now that, they're a little bit more of a pro-style offense. Now that the NFL has kind of more adopted a spread college type of offense, a lot of these guys can come in and make a big difference immediately. And so I kind of think that would be the more savvy route. I think you can get starting level talent in day one or day two of this particular draft as well. So, I mean, it's possible if Brad Holmes kind of wants to make like a 1 year run here. I imagine you're probably not signing Mike Evans to that long of a deal. But given that it's not a huge need, given that they're already spreading the ball out to 3 or 4 or 5 guys that are getting 4 or 5 targets a game, I think that's a little bit of a luxury pick that wouldn't follow the kind of blueprint of Brad Holmes always saying, like, this isn't a 1 year Cinderella story. We're looking to make this a franchise that is always being competitive. That feels like a little bit of a short-term move that might be a little bit too pricey for him.
Jeremy Reisman just talking the common sense into me. That's why you're here, because I look at him like, oh, shiny toy, and I don't do that. It is, and I'm conservative as conservative gets, but I look at Mike Williams, I'm like, dude's never had, Mike Evans, I'm like, dude's never had less than 1,000 yards in a season. Is it worth just throwing him out there a little bit? Because I tend to feel like, a guy like Jameson, for example, I feel like J-Mo is going to be a little bit less expensive when we get to the contract talks because of the injury and the lack of production there. I think that we might be able to get him on a little bit cheaper, but that's just my own personal thought. Last one here for you. Amon-Ra St. Brown, the rumors are circulating 3 years, $25 million per year. Do you think there's any steam to that?
I mean, I think, I had thrown out my own personal estimate before that, and I was more like 23.5 or something like that. But 25 is certainly reasonable and possible. I don't have any inside sources as to where that currently stands, but yeah, I think there's 4 guys who are making $25 million or more right now, and 3 years is kind of interesting because I expected something more, but at the same time, that would allow him to kind of cash in on that second big contract while he's still in his 20s. So maybe that's kind of the thinking of having kind of a shorter term extension than I would expect. But listen, this team loves everything that Amon-Ra is about. He's been such an essential part to everything they do in terms of demeanor, in terms of culture, and obviously he's like the team's favorite third down conversion machine. So I think 25 it sounds like a lot, and I know a lot of people look at a guy like him because he isn't that prototypical big-time receiver that are making 70-yard touchdown catches very often, but he's just as essential to what the Lions do, and I think that's important to point out. Is that he's what the Lions want. He's the chain mover. He's just a perfect fit in Jared Goff, and so I think he's worth $25 million a year to the Lions. So, yeah, I think that number is very much what we could end up seeing for him.
I think Jeremy Reisman's worth $25 million a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's what I think of you, Mr. Reisman. Hey, you can find him on Twitter at Detroit Online. We'll discuss his contract details there. Jeremy, my friend, as always, partner, appreciate the time this morning.
Of course, buddy. Appreciate it.
There he goes. That's Jeremy Reisman. Uh-oh, guys.